Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We are diving straight into the deep end today. Imagine a digital collision between two completely different ways of seeing the world. On one side, we have this viral sensation, a video that promises to answer all atheist arguments in a 10-minute speedrun.
Right. It's super fast, very confident, and it got millions of views. It's incredibly popular.
And on the other side, we have the counterpunch. A meticulous hour-long dismantling of those very answers by a philosopher who just refuses to let these huge questions get reduced to sound bites.
And this isn't just about two YouTubers arguing online. I mean, it is that, but it's also a stress test for the things we hold most dear.
Absolutely. We are talking about the existence of God, the origins of morality.
The reality of demons, even. And the really big one. Why can smart people look at the exact same universe and see two totally, completely different realities?
That is the hook for today.
Yeah.
We aren't just refereeing a debate. We are analyzing a clash of worldviews. We're going to look at the logic, the evidence, and, the emotional stakes.
We have a massive stack of notes here.
We do. Covering everything from, the geography of belief to the Hitler question. And there's even this really unsettling story about a woman who supposedly levitated.
Yeah, that part's wild. But it's a fascinating case study in how we process information, right? You have the speed run approach, these quick, intuitive answers that feel good and sort of reinforce what you already think.
Right, the comfort food of arguments.
Exactly. And then you have the deep dive, the slow, sometimes really uncomfortable analytical work that challenges those very intuitions.
So let's get right into it. The first major clash happens over a map. I think everyone has heard some version of this argument.
Yeah.
You only believe what you believe because of where you were born.
Right. It's the geographical lottery. If you just visualize a map of the world right now, you don't just see landmasses.
You see pockets of belief.
Pockets of belief, exactly. If you drop a pin in Indonesia, you are statistically overwhelmingly likely to find a Muslim.
Drop a pin in the rural American South.
You'll find a Protestant Christian. Drop one in ancient Scandinavia, you'd find people worshiping Thor and Odin.
And the skeptic looks at that map and says, this looks like culture.
Yeah.
It looks exactly like language or cuisine. I speak English because I was raised in an English-speaking house, not because English is the objectively true language of the cosmos.
Precisely. And in the source video, the 10-minute answer, the apologist, a channel called Redeemed Zoomer, he tries to shut this down immediately. He calls it the genetic fallacy.
Okay, let's define that for everyone, because genetic here doesn't mean DNA, right? It's not about your genes.
No, not DNA at all. It refers to the genesis, or the origin of a claim. The genetic fallacy is when you try to invalidate an idea just by pointing out where it came from.
Okay.
The classic example is, imagine a math teacher who is a known liar and a thief, just a terrible person. But he walks up to the chalkboard and writes 2 + 2 = 4.
He's still right. The math is true, even if the source, the person, is flawed.
Exactly. So the apologist argues, just because your belief in Christianity originated from your geography, just because you learned it from your parents in Alabama, doesn't automatically mean the belief itself is false.
The argument is you could have just been lucky enough to be born in the place where the truth is taught.
That's the claim, and he cleverly flips it on the atheist, too.
Right, he says, if you were born in medieval Europe, you wouldn't be an atheist either. You're just a product of your time.
And, formally, that logic holds up. The origin doesn't, in itself, disprove the truth.
Yeah.
However, Alex O'Connor, the philosopher providing the rebuttal, points out that this completely misses the bigger picture. He calls it the genetic fallacy.
This is where my brain started to hurt a little, but in a good way. Break this down for us.
So O'Connor's argument is that we aren't just talking about the origin of a single belief. We are talking about what that geographical clustering implies about the nature of God. You have to ask, what kind of God are we talking about here? If we are talking about, say, a local tribal deity who only cares about one specific valley in the ancient Near East, then the map makes perfect sense.
But that's not what Christians are claiming, or Muslims.
Yeah.
They're claiming a universal God.
Exactly. A universal God who desires a personal relationship with every single human being on the planet. A God for whom belief is literally the difference between eternal salvation and eternal separation.
And that's where the divine hiddenness argument comes into play.
It has to, because if this all-powerful God wants to be known by everyone, and he has the ability to reveal himself to everyone, Why does the map of his revelation look exactly like the map of a man-made cultural trend?
That's a great way to put it. Why does the spread of the truth look exactly like the spread of the British Empire or the Ottoman conquests?
Why is it constrained by trade routes and military borders? It's the distribution that's the problem. O'Connor uses this great analogy. If atheism is true, if religion is a purely human, man-made phenomenon,
We would expect the map to look like this.
we would expect it to look like a patchwork quilt of local myths and political histories. Of course it would. But if theism is true, if there's a single universal God, shouldn't the truth transcend borders more effectively?
It seems like it would be a bit more evenly spread, or at least not so perfectly correlated with your passport.
That is the core of the critique. It's not that geography proves God doesn't exist. It's that the geographical distribution of religion looks exactly like what you'd expect if religion were a human invention, and nothing like what you'd expect if it were a divine revelation intended for all of humankind.
It's a probability argument, really. It pushes you to ask, am I right, or am I just lucky to have been born here?
And that's an uncomfortable question for anyone.
It is. Okay, let's shift gears from the map of the Earth to the map of the universe, specifically science. This is always a messy, messy battleground in these debates.
It is. And in this exchange, we see a very specific and I think very common tension regarding what science can and cannot do.
The source material highlights a really interesting contradiction. On one hand, the apologist claims science can neither prove nor disprove God. We hear this all the time.
Oh yeah, it's a go-to defense.
An atheist asks for evidence, and the believer says, God is supernatural. He's outside the box. Science only measures what's inside the box.
This is the idea of non-overlapping magisteria, or NOMA, as Stephen Jay Gould called it. Science stays in its lane, dealing with the empirical world. Religion stays in its lane, dealing with meaning and morality.
It's a convenient defense, really, because it insulates faith from any kind of empirical scrutiny.
Right.
You can't test it, so you can't debunk it.
Right, it's a firewall.
But then, and this is the gotcha moment that O'Connor points out, in the very next breath, the same apologist will use scientific complexity as proof for God.
Oh, all the time. They'll point to the fine-tuning of the universal constants or the incredible complexity of DNA and say,
Look at this design, it's so complex. Science proves there must be a creator.
it creates this heads I win, tails you lose dynamic. O'Connor points out that you simply can't have it both ways.
It's a logical inconsistency.
A huge one. If science discovers something that looks like design, the apologist hugs the scientist and says, see, evidence. But if science discovers something that contradicts the religious narrative, like, say, the age of the Earth, or evolutionary origins that don't match Genesis.
Suddenly it's, oh, silly scientists, you can't touch the supernatural. Stay in your lane.
Right. Science is irrelevant here.
So the point is, if scientific evidence can count for God, then the lack of evidence, or worse, contrary evidence, must be allowed to count against God. You have to use the same scale, the same standard of evidence for both sides of the ledger.
Exactly. And speaking of evidence, we have to talk about Julia.
Okay, I have to be honest. I was taking notes on the philosophy stuff, feeling very academic, discussing fallacies. And then I hit this section on Julia and I actually paused the recording.
It's a total change of pace.
We go from discussing gravity and DNA to full-blown demonic possession.
It is a jarring shift, but the apologist brings this up to counter the claim that there is no evidence for the supernatural. He cites a book by a psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Gallagher, called Demonic Foes.
And the details here are straight out of a horror movie. We are not talking about someone just, acting weird or having a psychological episode. We were talking about specific paranormal claims.
Very specific. Julia was a patient of Dr. Gallagher's. The claim is that she had knowledge she couldn't possibly have had. She had what they call hidden knowledge.
Like what?
For example, Gallagher claims that one night, while he was at home miles away from Julia, his cats went absolutely berserk, just screeching, fighting each other, tearing up the house for no reason.
Okay, that's weird.
The next day, he sees Julia and she looks at him and says, "So, Dr. Gallagher, how did you like those cats last night?"
Oh, come on. That gives you chills. It really does.
It implies remote viewing or some kind of psychic connection, a demonic one in his view.
And she supposedly knew other things too, right? Like how the doctor's mother died, which was a secret.
Yes, and that she could speak fluent Latin, a language she'd never studied. But the big one, the one that really matters for our discussion on evidence, is the levitation.
This is the showstopper.
It is. The claim is that Julia levitated. She literally floated in the air for 30 minutes during an exorcism.
30 minutes. We aren't talking about a split-second jump or a muscle spasm that makes it look like she lifted off the bed. We are talking about defying the known laws of physics for half an hour.
If that is true, that is game over for atheism.
It's game over for physics as we know it. That is a straight-up miracle.
It would be, and this is where the deep dive approach really shines versus the speed run. O'Connor didn't just accept the anecdote at face value.
He didn't just watch the YouTube clip.
No, he went out and bought Dr. Gallagher's book. He wanted to see the primary data. He wanted to know, did Dr. Gallagher, the psychiatrist, the man of science, see her float?
What did he find?
He didn't.
He didn't see it.
No. O'Connor reveals that in the book, Gallagher admits he was not present for the levitation.
You're kidding me.
Not at all. He reports it based on the testimony of others, the priests and assistants who were in the room at the time.
So the medically documented case of the supernatural, the best piece of evidence they have, basically boils down to, a priest told me a scary story.
That's the crux of the issue. It's hearsay. And O'Connor makes a really, really sharp point about the era we live in. We are in the age of the smartphone.
There are cameras everywhere.
Billions of them. High-definition video cameras in pockets all over the world. We film everything. We film our lunches. We film cats doing absolutely nothing.
But for the most miraculous event of the century, a human being floating in defiance of gravity for 30 minutes, we have zero footage. Not a single blurry photo.
It raises a massive red flag. If these things are happening, why is the evidence always an anecdote from a believer, passed down secondhand? Why is it never a video? Why is it never a verifiable measurement?
It goes right back to that double standard we were talking about with science. If you want to claim medical evidence for the supernatural, you need to meet the standards of medicine and science. And my friend saw it. Doesn't get published in the New England Journal of Medicine.
It doesn't even get you past a peer review. It also touches on basic psychology. Confirmation bias is incredibly powerful.
Of course.
If you are in a dimly lit room, you're highly emotional, you're expecting to see a demon, and a woman is thrashing around in a chair, your brain can interpret shadows and movement in very strange ways. Without hard data, the human mind is a notoriously unreliable narrator.
Which is the perfect segue to our next section, the reliability of narrators. We have to talk about the Bible.
The book itself, the foundational document.
The source material spends a lot of time on contradictions. The 10-minute answer tries to wave them away, basically saying, look, the church has known about these so-called contradictions for 2,000 years. If they were real deal breakers, Christianity would have collapsed by now. There's always a theological explanation.
Which is true. These aren't new discoveries found on the internet. Church fathers were writing about these issues in the 3rd and 4th centuries. But O'Connor argues that the explanations often require what he calls theological gymnastics.
I like that phrase.
It's good, isn't it? They aren't the natural, straightforward reading of the text. They are forced reconciliations because you are starting from the premise that the text must be perfect.
Okay, let's get into the weeds with the specific case studies because the details really matter here. First up, the genealogies of Jesus.
This is a classic. It's one of the first things people notice when they read the Gospel side by side. You have the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. Both try to trace the lineage of Jesus back to King David to prove he's the Messiah.
But the lists of names are just different.
Completely different. Most famously, Matthew says Joseph's father was Jacob. Luke says Joseph's father was Heli.
So who was his dad?
Right. And the harmonization attempts here are legendary. Some apologists say, oh, one is Mary's lineage and one is Joseph's.
Even though the text explicitly says Joseph, son of, in both accounts.
Exactly. The text doesn't support that reading. St. Augustine had this really elaborate theory that maybe Joseph was adopted, so one list is his biological father and one is his legal father.
But O'Connor asks this simple question, is that what the text says? Or are we just inventing a backstory to fix a hole in the plot?
Precisely. If I read 2 newspaper articles, and one says the president's father is named Bob, and the other says the president's father is named Steve, my first assumption isn't some complex adoption scenario.
No. You assume one of them got it wrong. It's a factual error.
It's the most parsimonious explanation. Then there's the staff contradiction.
This one is so simple, it's almost funny.
It is. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is sending out the disciples and he tells them to take a staff for the journey.
Okay, take a staff. Got it.
But in Luke's gospel, he gives the same speech and says, take no staff.
So, which is it?
And again, the defense gets creative. Well, maybe he meant don't buy a new staff, but you can take the one you have. Or maybe one was a metaphorical staff of spiritual authority.
It's possible, I guess. But it really feels like damage control. It doesn't feel like a natural reading.
It doesn't. But the most significant one for me, the one that really gets to the heart of the matter, has to be the empty tomb.
This isn't a minor detail. This is the central event of the entire faith.
It is. The resurrection is everything.
Okay, so in John's Gospel, Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, finds it empty. She runs to the disciples and says, and this is a direct quote, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him."
Right. She is distraught. She's panicked. She thinks the body has been stolen.
It's a grave robbery. That's her interpretation.
Keep that firmly in mind. She thinks it's a grave robbery.
But in Matthew's Gospel, the scene is totally different. Mary goes to the tomb. There is a massive earthquake. An angel descends from heaven in a flash of lightning, rolls back the stone, sits on it.
It's a huge, dramatic, supernatural event.
And the angel tells the women, "Do not be afraid. He is not here. He has risen," just as he said.
That is a massive narrative difference. Because if Mary just saw a terrifying angel descend from the sky and was explicitly told he is risen, why in the world would she then run to the disciples crying, "I don't know where the body is, it just doesn't fit"?
The two stories seem mutually exclusive.
They do. But here's the defense the apologist uses, and I hear this one a lot. It's the courtroom witness defense.
Right. The idea is that if two witnesses in court agree on every single tiny detail of a crime, it sounds rehearsed.
It sounds like collusion, like they got their story straight beforehand.
But minor differences actually prove authenticity because that's how human memory works. People remember different things.
And that is a valid point for minor details. If one witness says the getaway car was a blue Toyota and another says it was a dark green Honda, that's fine. The core event, a car speeding away, is the same.
But O'Connor argues this defense completely fails when the contradictions hit the core narrative.
Exactly. If one witness says the suspect drove away in a blue car and the other witness says the suspect grew wings and flew into the sun, that is not a minor difference.
That's a fundamental disagreement about what happened.
And Mary, knowing for a fact that Jesus is alive versus Mary thinking the body was stolen, is a fundamental difference in the reality of that moment.
The source material actually includes a live experiment to prove how unreliable memory and oral tradition are. I want to try this with you right now.
Okay, let's do it. I'm ready.
Okay. I am going to read a sentence, a slightly complex one, and I just want you to remember it. Ready?
Ready?
The specific mechanisms regarding the physiological evolution of the mammalian eye remain a subject of considerable debate amongst evolutionary biologists.
Okay, got it in my head.
We'll come back to that in just a minute.
Really?
But the point O'Connor makes is that if we can't do this in real time, how can we possibly trust oral tradition?
Right, because the Gospels weren't written the next day. They were written decades after the events they describe.
30, 40, maybe 60 years later for John.
For that whole time, these stories were being passed around by word of mouth, from person to person, town to town.
So pop quiz. Let's see how you did. Repeat the sentence I just said, word for word.
Okay. The specific mechanisms regarding the physiological evolution of the mammalian eye are a subject of debate among biologists.
So close. But you missed remain, considerable, and evolutionary. And that was, what, 45 seconds ago?
And I was actively trying to memorize it. I knew you were going to test me.
Exactly. Now imagine passing that sentence down for 40 years in a different language before writing it down. It doesn't mean the core event didn't happen. It doesn't mean there wasn't a historical Jesus.
Of course not.
But it does seriously undermine the idea of biblical inerrancy or perfect historical dictation. It suggests we are reading a game of telephone, not a perfect court transcript.
It puts the burden of proof back on the text. If the text is the perfect, inspired word of God, why does it struggle with this level of basic consistency?
Moving from history to morality. This is where the gloves really, really come off. We have to talk about war. And inevitably, we have to talk about Hitler.
The Godwin's law of theological debate, it always ends up here.
It does. So the atheist argument is usually, religion causes wars. The apologist in the video counters with a statistic I'd never heard before. He says only 7% of all wars in history were caused by religion.
And he adds that if you remove Islamic wars from the calculation, it drops to just 3%.
Which is an attempt to minimize the damage, to say religion is basically a peaceful force.
But O'Connor's rebuttal is really interesting. He basically says, okay, let's grant you the statistic for the sake of argument, 7%. Isn't it a problem that religion causes any wars?
Right. If this is supposed to be a system of objective morality given by a loving God, why is it responsible for even 7% of the organized bloodshed in human history?
He uses the Nazi analogy, which is always risky, but I think it's logically effective here. He points out that National Socialism only caused one war. Just one, World War II.
Well, that doesn't make it a benign ideology.
Of course not. The quantity of wars isn't the only metric for how dangerous or immoral a worldview is. One really, really bad war is enough.
And then we get to the man himself. Was Hitler a Christian? Was he an atheist? This is the eternal debate.
The apologist claims Hitler was not a true Christian, and that the most murderous regimes in history, Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, were explicitly atheists.
That's the standard response. Atheism killed more people.
But O'Connor points out the historical record regarding Hitler is, well, it's messy. He was baptized Catholic, he was never officially excommunicated by the church, and he literally wrote in Mein Kampf that in fighting the Jews, he was doing the handiwork of the Lord.
It's pretty damning.
Now, the apologist will say Hitler was lying, that he was a secret atheist just using religion as a tool to manipulate the masses.
And this is where the conversation gets really deep and, I think, much more interesting. But Connor says, okay, let's assume he was lying. Let's assume for a moment that Hitler was the biggest atheist in history. What does that tell us?
It tells us that Hitler, a master manipulator of crowds, recognized that religious belief was the single most powerful tool he had to motivate ordinary soldiers to commit unimaginable atrocities.
The belt buckles. We have to mention the belt
The
buckles.
Wehrmacht soldiers, standard issue. Their belt buckles were inscribed with the words Gott mit uns,
God with us.
God with us. A chilling image, isn't it?
It is.
O'Connor's point is that atheism alone doesn't provide a divine mandate for violence. You can't tell a soldier, the universe is indifferent and ultimately meaningless, now go kill those people for the glory of nothing. It just doesn't work as a motivator.
No, you need a higher power to justify the unjustifiable. You need to tell that 19-year-old boy that he is on a holy mission, that God is on his side.
So even if the leader is an atheist, the mechanism of the atrocity is often religious, or at least it's structured like a religion. It's the tool that turns men into monsters.
Exactly. And speaking of tools of oppression, we have to go there. We have to talk about slavery.
This is the ethical minefield that, for many people, does the most damage to the concept of objective biblical morality.
It's the hardest one to explain away, I think.
I agree.
The apologetic defense is usually twofold. One, the Bible didn't endorse slavery, it just regulated it to make it nicer because ancient society wasn't ready to ban it. And two, Christians led the abolition movement.
But O'Connor forces us to just look at the text itself, not the interpretation, the words on the page. He cites Exodus 21, and it is brutal.
What does it say?
It explicitly says you can beat your slave with a rod, and as long as they don't die within a day or two, you are not to be punished. And it gives the reason why.
Because the slave is your property.
The text says, for he is his money. The King James Version says money. That is incredibly hard to read in the 21st century.
It is indefensible by modern standards.
Right.
And the New Testament isn't the get-out-of-jail-free card that people think it is either.
Not at all. Both there and Peter and Ephesians explicitly say, slaves, submit to your masters. Not masters, free your slaves. Paul sends a runaway slave, Onesimus, back to his master.
There was a visual mention in the source material that really stuck with me. The slave Bible.
Oh, that is a powerful and horrifying historical artifact.
Can you describe it for the listeners? I think it's so important.
So in the 1800s, British missionaries and slave owners in the West Indies created a redacted, a censored version of the Bible specifically for slaves.
What did they cut out?
They literally cut out any pages that might incite rebellion. They removed the entire book of Exodus because the story of God freeing the Israelites from slavery in Egypt was considered too dangerous. But you know what they kept in.
The verses that say, slaves, obey your masters.
Every single one.
It proves the point, doesn't it? If the Bible were clearly and unambiguously anti-slavery, you wouldn't need to censor it to keep people enslaved. The fact that you can use the Bible to keep people in chains, that you can preach from it in a pulpit to justify the ownership of other human beings, that's the problem.
O'Connor uses a time machine argument that I found really compelling. He says if you hopped in a time machine and went back to the American South in 1850 and walked into a church, the very first defense of slavery you would hear would be biblical.
The slave owners weren't quoting atheists, they were quoting chapter and verse from the Bible.
Exactly. So the argument that Christians ended slavery ignores the historical reality that Christians maintained slavery for centuries using the exact same book.
So O'Connor's argument is that the fact modern Christians reject slavery is due to secular moral progress. Human empathy evolved. We as a society decided owning people was wrong, and then we had to drag our interpretation of the text forward with us.
The text didn't pull us there. We pulled the text into the modern era.
That leads us right into the darkest part of this whole conversation. If God allows slavery, if God allows war, why? The problem of evil.
This is the ancient question. Epicurus asked it thousands of years ago. We are still asking it today.
The apologist in the 10-minute video gives a shockingly blunt answer. He doesn't do the mysterious ways dance. He basically says, we deserve it.
It was stark. The argument is, humans are sinful from birth. God is the giver of life, and therefore he has the right to take it away. We all deserve death because of our sin, so every single day we stay alive is an act of God's mercy.
So if a tsunami kills 200,000 people, that's not a tragedy. It's just justice arriving a little late.
That's the logical conclusion of that argument, yes.
Yep. O'Connor pushes back hard on the emotional and moral reality of this. He brings up pediatric cancer. He asks, can you really look at a child with leukemia, a 3-year-old who has done nothing wrong, who has barely learned to walk, and say, you deserve this?
It feels morally bankrupt to say that. It feels monstrous. But even if you accept the theological claim of original sin that we are all born corrupted, O'Connor plays the animal suffering card, and this, I think, is a devastating counterpoint.
Because animals don't sin.
Exactly. A deer burning to death in a forest fire hasn't rebelled against God. It hasn't eaten the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge. Yet, for millions of years, before humans even existed, the world was filled with predation, disease, starvation, and unimaginable suffering.
What was the apologist's response to the animal question?
Well, it was compensation.
Compensation.
The idea that animals who suffer in this life will be compensated in the afterlife.
Which implies a universe run on a kind of debt and repayment system rather than pure benevolence.
It's like saying, I'm going to torture you for an hour, but don't worry, I'll give you $1 million later, so it's okay.
And most of us would say, keep the money, just please don't torture me.
Exactly. A truly moral being wouldn't inflict the torture in the first place. The compensation doesn't excuse the abuse.
There was also a philosophical definition of evil thrown around to try and get God off the hook. The idea that evil is just the privation of good.
Right, like how cold is just the absence of heat. Cold isn't a thing in itself, it's just where the heat isn't.
So evil isn't a thing God created.
This is an old Augustinian idea. It tries to say God didn't create evil. He just created good, and evil is like the holes in the cheese.
But O'Connor, and I think most listeners, would struggle with this on a visceral level. If you are being tortured, if you are in agony, it doesn't feel like the absence of pleasure.
No, it feels like a very positive, very active force. Pain is an active signal in your nervous system. It's not a void. Calling a cancerous tumor a privation of good health feels like empty wordplay when you are the one dying from it. It doesn't solve the problem of why the whole is allowed to exist.
So if we have these deep logical and moral problems, what does it mean for God's power? We get into the paradoxes here.
The brain teasers, the philosophical puzzles.
Yeah, the classic one. Can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it?
And they actually agree on this one, which is nice to see. The standard answer from both sides is no.
Because omnipotence means being able to do anything that is logically possible.
Right. A rock too heavy for an all-powerful being to lift is a logical contradiction, like a square circle or a married bachelor. It's just nonsense words put together. It doesn't describe a possible thing.
But O'Connor brings up a trickier paradox, the omniscience paradox. This one spun me out a bit.
It's the infinite regress problem. If God knows everything, he must know all true propositions.
Right.
So he must also know the true proposition that he knows everything.
Okay, that follows.
And he must also know that he knows everything. And he must know that he knows that he knows that he knows.
It never ends. It's an infinite loop.
It suggests that a perfectly complete mind might be a logical impossibility, that it might be stuck in an infinite loop of self-reflection. But I think the more relatable paradox they discuss is the greater good defense for evil.
Right. This is the idea that God allows evil to exist so that he can be glorified in defeating it.
The hero needs a villain. You can't be the great healer if there's no sickness to heal. You can't show mercy if there's no sin to forgive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But O'Connor uses the cancer research analogy, and it's brilliant.
It is. He says, we all agree that cancer researchers are heroes. We give them Nobel Prizes. We value the cure they're working on.
Of course.
But, and this is the key, would we invent cancer just so we could have the applause for curing it?
No. That would be monstrous. That would be the act of a psychopath.
Precisely. A world without cancer is infinitely better than a world where cancer exists but is eventually conquered. So if God created a world with evil just to show off his ability to beat it, that makes him an arsonist who starts fires just to be the hero fireman who puts them out.
Man, that is a heavy image. It really challenges the whole idea that all things work together for good. Sometimes things are just bad, full stop.
And that leads us to the final frontier of this debate, the mind. Why do we believe any of this? If the evidence is shaky and the morality is tricky and the paradoxes are confusing, why is religion so persistent?
The skeptic often boils it down to wishful thinking.
Yeah.
You know, we want a daddy in the sky to take care of us. We're afraid of death and want to believe in an afterlife.
But the apologist in the video counters this with a really smart point. He says, wait a minute, Christianity isn't a fluffy cloud fantasy. The Bible says humans are terrible, sinful, fallen wretches who deserve hell. Who wishes for that? That's not a comforting fantasy.
At a good counter. Why would I invent a story where I'm the bad guy who needs saving?
But O'Connor brings in Friedrich Nietzsche to answer it, and he brings up the concept of slave morality.
Okay, unpack this for us. It sounds complicated.
It's actually pretty simple when you break it down. Nietzsche argued that you have to look at who started this religion.
Yeah.
It wasn't the powerful, it wasn't the Roman emperors, it was the oppressed, the poor, the slaves in the Roman Empire.
Right. People with zero power in the real world.
And if you are powerless, you can't realistically wish for power. You can't wish to be Caesar. It's an impossible dream. So, the most effective psychological coping mechanism isn't to wish for wealth, but to redefine poverty as a virtue.
So you don't say, I wish I was rich. You say, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven.
Exactly. You flip the entire script. You make your weakness your strength. You say, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. You say, I may be suffering now, but that means I'm special to God. The last shall be first.
So the fact that the Bible says we are weak and sinful isn't evidence against wishful thinking. It is the wishful thinking of the downtrodden. It reframes their suffering as a path to eternal glory.
That's the Nietzschean argument. It's the ultimate underdog story, written by the underdogs to make their miserable lives bearable.
That makes a disturbing amount of sense.
And then there's the brain chemistry argument. The apologist says, atheists claim spiritual experiences are just brain chemicals, but love is just brain chemicals, and my wife is still real.
It's a common analogy.
It is. And I liked O'Connor's response here. He admits, yes, love is chemicals. The feeling of love is a neurochemical event. But there's a crucial distinction.
And that is?
It's the distinction between the experience and the cause of the experience. If you feel love and you have a wife standing there in front of you, the probable cause of that feeling is your wife. The chemicals are just the messenger.
But if you feel God's presence when you're alone in an empty room,
then you have the chemicals, the feeling is absolutely real, but you haven't proved the external cause. If you feel love with no evidence of a partner, the partner might be imaginary. The feeling proves you have a brain, not that you have a God.
We're coming down to the wire here. Let's do a rapid-fire round on the historical Jesus. There were a few quick jabs thrown in the source material we should cover.
Yes. First, mythicism. The idea that Jesus never existed at all.
The Reddit atheist view, as it's sometimes called.
And both sides actually agree here. That's nonsense. Even the most skeptical secular scholars, so people like Bart Ehrman, agree that a guy named Jesus preached in Galilee and got crucified by the Romans. The whole Jesus is a copy of the Egyptian god Horus stuff is internet mythology, not serious history.
Okay, so he existed. But O'Connor does point out this idea of divinity evolution.
Right, and this is a much stronger historical point. If you read the Gospels in the chronological order, they were most likely written Mark first, then Matthew and Luke, then John last. You can see Jesus becoming more godlike over time.
In Mark, the earliest gospel, he's a prophet who gets distressed and anxious in the Garden of Gethsemane. In John, the last gospel, he is the cosmic I am who is in total control of every situation.
It suggests the legend grew with the telling. The further you get in time from the actual man, the bigger the halo gets.
And finally, faith. The apologist defines faith as trust based on evidence, using the analogy of trusting a restaurant not to poison you because they have a good health rating.
But O'Connor pushes back on that definition. He says if you have good evidence, you don't need faith. You just have trust, you have knowledge. Faith, in the religious context, is very often invoked precisely when the evidence runs out or is ambiguous.
It goes right back to that divine hiddenness problem we started with.
It's the central mystery. If God wants a relationship with us and the evidence is so ambiguous that it requires a leap of faith, why? Why is the most important truth in the entire universe the hardest one to verify?
Is the lingering question.
It is.
So we've covered geography, science, contradictions, Hitler, slavery, the problem of evil, and the psychology of the brain. It's been a marathon.
It absolutely has.
How do we synthesize this? We have the 10-minute answer versus the hour-long detailed rebuttal.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that answering an argument isn't the same as resolving it. The apologists in the short video provided answers. They were standard theological responses that have existed for centuries. They are, in a sense, shields.
But O'Connor showed that those shields often have cracks. You can answer the slavery charge by saying God regulated it, but in doing so, you create the bigger, more monstrous problem of a God who regulates the ownership of human beings instead of just banning it.
It feels like the 10-minute version is designed to stop you from thinking further. It's designed to say, don't worry, we have a neat answer for that, move along, nothing to see here. And the deep dive is designed to stop the car, get out, and say, wait, look closer at this. Are you sure that answer actually works?
Complexity matters. The world is complicated, and these questions are too.
And here's a final thought for you listening. We talked about the how versus the why. The apologist said God explains the why, while science explains the how.
It sounds nice and neat. Science gives us the mechanism. God gives us the meaning.
But ask yourself this. If we accept that God is the why behind the universe, are we comfortable with the answer that gives us? If science explains how a child gets cancer, the cellular mutation, the uncontrolled division, and God explains why, that implies there is a reason for it, a purpose.
Is the why actually more terrifying than the silence of a godless universe?
Is it scarier to think you're alone in the dark, or to think you're in the dark with someone who could turn on the lights at any moment, but for his own reasons, chooses not to?
That is the question that keeps this debate alive. We'd love to know what you think. And hey, go back and try that memory test again. See if you can get physiological evolution right this time. Until next time, keep thinking deeper.